Welcome to Evokat Premier. In this video, we are going to be walking through all of the primary functions of Premier, hopefully providing a complete guide to the core of the solution, much like a typical training session. We have attempted to build Premier on a similar foundation to our legacy Evokat 2.5 solution, so hopefully the learning curve will not be too steep and much of this will feel familiar. As you watch, please keep in mind that Evokat evolves with the industry. So as the standards change, and as new mandates are delivered by retailers, Evokat changes as well. There may be some features and tools that have been modified by the time you watch, and possibly new features will have been added as well. Anytime you have questions on your catalog data, questions on the application, or suggestions for additional features, please reach out to us so we can work together to move your data forward. We're going to be walking through a sample catalog that is staged to be at a similar point to what you may see when you first log in. So let's get started. When you first log into Premier, you should be presented with a screen similar to this. You'll see a tile representing your catalog, or in some cases, multiple tiles. Within Premier, it is possible that each organization has multiple catalogs. So if you feel like you need to divide your data for some reason, let us know and we can enable that. As you come into the system, you'll click on the catalog to activate that or set it as your active catalog. But when you first log in, that's kind of annoying to do every time. So I suggest every user, first thing they do, go up to the user profile and change the home page selection from catalog to either catalog health or item search. So changing that to catalog health and saving that value means that when I go to the home page or when I log in, I'm taken directly to that page. I can still come back to the catalog selection by using the active catalog link up here and come back and choose the other catalog if I'd rather, but we're going to use the training catalog today. So in this case, I've used the ACES Catalog Health page as my default home page. That's typically what I suggest people use. This page is similar to our Analyze My Catalog page from the legacy system, but we have some additional values here, and what we're seeing is the health of the catalog across the entire catalog, not broken down by tags or any other subcategories. So in this particular set of data, we have a little over 17,000 records, and then I'll explain what each of these different validation issues are. The first two, invalid vehicle definitions and invalid configurations, are very similar. An invalid definition is a situation where you have an ID that is in your record that is no longer supported in the VCDB at all. Typically, you'll find that with engine bases primarily, but submodels and some others. But this just means the Auto Care Association, in their wisdom, has decided they would like to drop an ID entirely. That means that your receiver, assuming they're using the most recent version of the VCDB, will not be able to decode that value. So therefore, we consider that an invalid definition as a critical issue, and it will not come out of the catalog in any kind of an ACES file. The next issue down, invalid vehicle configuration, is similar, but in these cases, it's just the configuration of attributes that is not valid. So you're still using valid IDs. Your receiver can still translate those into actual terms, but it's representing a combination of values that are not valid. So we'll start there with the resolution process. By clicking on our issue list, we'll then see vehicle batches that have issues. And by batch, in this case, we mean a year, make, model, part type, and position combination. So this has an invalid vehicle configuration. I can view the details or open in a new tab. If I'd like to keep my record set here open, I can go ahead and open in a new tab and not have to keep coming back to regenerate this page. I have some additional filters as well. I can change the type of record I'm looking at, focus on a particular part type, change a vehicle make or choose a vehicle make, or target a particular tag. But in this case, we'll just go ahead and pick our first record and see what the issues are. We refer to this batch, year, make, model, part type, and position, and we look at all of the records that fit that batch. So even though the first 10 or so here are valid, there's no issues, we're still wanting to let you know what the records are out there so you can kind of see the forest for the trees, at least in terms of this particular batch. So as I look at these numbers, I'm not exactly sure why this particular record also has a wheelbase definition and some others don't. So you've got to make some decisions with your information here, notes and that kind of a thing about what the appropriate action should be. We do try to highlight the IDs throughout the system, so you'll see IDs a lot more than you did before. That's the engine base ID or fuel type ID or those kind of things as I mouse over those values. But this particular record shows as an invalid configuration. So to resolve that, click my little fix icon over here. And similar to the legacy system, we show what the valid combinations of those attributes are. So we have our basic definition up here of the year, make, model. These are the attributes that are defined along with their IDs for the engine base. And below that, we see what the valid configurations are. Within the diesel family, the wheelbases are 158 or 176 inches. So the 138 is what is not valid here. Now, I'm going to need to do some research on this record to figure out why this is configured this way, to know what to do, but you have a couple of different options. If you wanted to go ahead and change the record to one of these, you can simply click one or as many of these options as you needed. You can also choose to ignore this configuration warning, and that forces the record to be kept in the system. It's basically acknowledging that you know this is an invalid configuration, so we won't really show it on the scorecard anymore, but we'll still remind you that this is a configuration that you've forcibly kept in the system. That action should not be used, should not be relied upon to resolve issues unless you are 100% sure that vehicle is a valid configuration, and hopefully you're going to work with AutoCare on putting that into the system. And you can also delete this record entirely. If back on the batch resolution page I saw another record that was similar to this one, I could just delete this record and move on from there. Back on the batch resolution page, there's a couple of other options to be aware of as well. On each record, instead of clicking the fix icon, we could also edit the record directly, which would be the same as editing any other application record. We can duplicate it. Occasionally there's instances where you need to split a record apart, add some other modifiers or notes or something like that. So you can duplicate it here and then modify them individually. And then we also have an option to revalidate the batch. So if we feel like we've maybe addressed whatever the conflict is on a particular record, either through one of these screens or going back to another page and adding a label description or something else, I can also revalidate this batch. So that's basically pushing just the records for this particular year, make, model, part type, and position back through the validation engine just to do a check to say, okay, did I solve everything? Did I create anything new? So you get almost that instant feedback. We say to allow 5 minutes. That's generally overkill to get that validation back, but it's a good thing to do if you've been making a lot of changes through a mechanism other than these particular screens to see if we resolved your issue. We can navigate back to our issues or go all the way back to the health page, and then we can start talking about the direct and extended conflicts. These terms are carried directly from the legacy system, a direct conflict being two parts that are defined to fit the exact same vehicle. Drilling into that, in this particular example, we have these two parts that are both fitting a 3.0 liter electric gas, same notes and everything here. So you'd need to do some research to see what the issue was, edit those records, do whatever you need to do to resolve them. And then extended conflicts are a little bit more complicated. If you're familiar with that from the legacy system, those are two parts that have some overlapping coverage. You may have something referred to as a CNC overlap in an Epicor assessment, or a comment, no comment, or in some cases you'll have attributes mapped for one record and not for another. So our validation engine will map out all of your records to a consistent set of attributes to determine what those overlaps are. So as we drill into those, again we see our batches, and then all of these records are showing as extended conflicts because these don't have any attributes mapped. These do, and this one doesn't have a note, creating a CNC type of relationship across the board on all of these. So doing some research, you may need to just get rid of this record or modify it, add some notes. But the purpose of this page where we see all of the records for this particular batch is hopefully to encourage some consistency in the way elements are communicated. There's a variety of notes here for each of these starter cables, and sometimes it doesn't help. There isn't really a way to make them consistent, but other times you might recognize this particular record has 2 without AC notes. That's a little bit strange and need to clean that up. Or the formatting of some values. There's some title case kind of mixed with lowercase, that sort of a thing. So look over these and hopefully recognize some opportunities to make your data a little bit more consistent. But the resolution process, again, is about the same. We just edit these records. You have mixed records in there of an invalid that you can fix as well, but go through and resolve those issues, revalidate the batch if you'd like to, and then go back to the issues, and you can actually get all the way back to the ACES Health page. The numbers, the metrics that you see here, this is a static value from the last time your catalog was either validated or you regenerated the health metrics. So as you resolve issues, these numbers will not change. But there's a process through the system tasks that you can run, we'll cover that later, to update this information. Some additional information on this health page include showing the versions of the standards that we're currently supporting. The new version of the BCDB comes out generally the last Friday of the month and should be updated in Evokat sometime over that weekend. Occasionally there'll be some issues and concerns that cause us to delay that load, but that will show you when you generate an ACES file which version it'll be validated against. There's a link out to the official AutoCare release notes if you want to read up on the current and future releases, and then also a count of your kept invalids. We talked about the kept invalids before. We don't really encourage that, but it is technically valid in the ACES standard, so you can do it, but we still want you to know how many of them are out there, so we show you that number. As long as we're talking about invalid configurations and other health issues, there are a couple of ways that we have to allow for some bulk changes of that information. One is through the application menu and then bulk change tools. And first we go to VCDB sourced changes. Over time, the AutoCare Association has gotten much better about logging changes within the VCDB, specifically the engine-based changes they've been making. So we've looked over that data, and if we can identify basically a trusted chain of data from one record to another, we load that as one of the VCDB sourced ACES changes. So each month we look over those, we can see the versions that have been out there and how many changes we found in each of those releases. From here we can click View Change Details, and it'll give us a breakdown of which engines changed. They basically dropped this engine entirely from the VCDB, and any vehicle that was using this is now using the ID 819. You can see it's a different CI, or this one has a CI, and that's usually the difference. There'll be some other CC or CI change there. But if you have records in your catalog that are impacted by this change, you'll see a count that comes up over here under Related Fitment Records. And if you want to action those changes, just click Apply, and then it will make that change across all of your records. Please be sure you understand what's happening and whether you want to make that change. We are not doing any kind of validation or research on the vehicle itself. We're simply following the chain of data that is provided in the VCDB, their documentation and that change log of what they have modified within their database. Another option for doing bulk changes are community source changes. So the VCDB source requires a very clear chain of events in the log files that come with the VCDB. But the community source changes are simply going to be updates that other users out in the system have found over time. So as you're resolving invalid records, if you keep being presented with a particular Honda, so it keeps presenting me with an issue that the Honda Accord with engine base 46 is not valid, and I keep changing it to 17706, and I have to keep doing it again and again. You can come back and look at these community source changes and see if somebody has already put in a rule that you may want to follow. And if you have found something that is not already documented in this, you can add your own change. However, this process is purposely built to rely on the IDs of the specific make, model, and engine bases. And that's just a mechanism to make sure that if you are putting in a change, you've basically done the research, you understand what the VCDB is, and you really understand the change. Because all of these changes, there is no undo. It is very important that you understand what's going to happen. So if I did want to make this Honda change that I referenced earlier, I would click the stage option over here, and then it gives me a summary of what is going to change. It's going to find records, in this case, that match a make of Honda, particular year range, only the Accord models, doesn't matter about the submodel, and then this particular engine base. And then we're going to change that. It's going to be the same model, same submodel, but a new engine base. And optionally, I can say I only want to apply this change to records that are currently flagged as invalid configurations. So if you need to target things down in a certain way, that is one way you can do it. And the person that loaded this information, they can put in some kind of a note summarizing any research they had, or kind of a summary of the information, any kind of helpful information that's out there. We'll do a check of how many records would be impacted by this change. In this particular case, there are not any. But again, there's a note and a warning that this is there's no undo, so make sure this is something you want to do. If you're okay with it, simply say apply change, and that will go out and update all of those records. When you make those changes, that is not going to prompt a mass revalidation of your data, so you have to do your own revalidation after this. Coming back to the other community source changes, there's also an option to report this, and most all the pages out here, by the way, have some kind of information on the page explaining how to use it, what the information means. But if you see somebody has created a change record here that raises a concern, you don't think it's a valid change, or you've done some research and don't agree with it, you can report that, and that sends a message to us saying that you have a problem with that submission. We should look at it and decide if it should stay out there or not. So those are changes, those are ways to change your records in bulk. There's also, through the catalog builder, which we'll talk about in depth later, a way to export your records and bring them back in. But for a moment, let's jump over to the product side of the coin, and we'll just search for a random item here. Actually, we'll start at the item search page. Item search page provides a way to search by a SKU or a part number. And if you've already watched the video explaining the difference between an item ID or item SKU and a selling part number, you'll understand what I mean there. There's a selling part number or interchange part number search, and then additional filters for life cycle and ACES part type. If I leave this blank and click search, it brings back the most recently created items. And from here, I can click on the part number to go to the product profile page. I can click on the information. There's a little wrench to go to the ACES setup tab, and then the gear goes directly to the item ACES applications. Also want to draw your attention to the fact that the selling part number has a red undefined. That is a flag because in order for a record to come out of the file in an ACES or a PIES XML file, you must have a selling part number defined. So anytime you pull up the search, if you see a red undefined there, it's a bit of a flag to say that's something you want to look at. There are reasons why you may want to keep a record without a selling part number, If something's in the life cycle yet, where it's not released, perhaps you want to not define the selling part number, but still that's a bit of a red flag that something's not quite right there. Drilling into a particular item, we can see on the profile page, we have a list of the tags that this item is included in. I can click and select from any of the other tags that are created out in this catalog, or I could just type in a value and create a new tag if I wanted to that way. Other elements on this page, there's a product data coverage rating. This is our own kind of suggested guideline of what product information is requested across your major suppliers or major receivers out there. To update this information, there's a system task, or click this little arrow and that will regenerate the rating for this particular item. If you're curious why it just has a 1 star or how to get further up the chain, you can click on the question mark, drill down to that particular item, and you'll see the elements that are covered versus the ones that are not. There's a high-level view of the application health per item, list of selling part numbers, and then a recent history. So the history will be tracked in the system if you are using this GUI to make the changes. If you're doing bulk loads through that catalog builder, those changes are not tracked. But if you're actually using the application, it will track most changes down here in a recent history, so you can see what's happened. Some other functions, as long as we're on this particular page, within this item, which is the SKU, we can edit it and see the actual SKU number, an internal note field. Briefly, this supplier part number, some of our partners rely on getting data in. They're basically distributors of some other companies' products. So those suppliers often cannot generate a file using the targeted part number. So this provides a mechanism for a receiver to load data from a supplier that cannot provide their own part number. So within this particular catalog, this part number is a PTC number, but the supplier can only provide their root number, which is the 8751, and this relationship allows that bulk load to happen. That doesn't come up for very many people, but just so you understand what that field is there for. This internal note value also, that is not related to anything in pies. It's just your own reference for anything that you need to detail about the item. Can delete the item, obviously, as a whole, and then we can copy the item and have some additional functionality there. So when I say copy item, it gives me a process where I can decide what additional elements I might want to copy to this new part. So if I'm creating a new item in the system, it's generally going to reuse some of the same descriptions and other terms that I use in another item. So I might search for a similar item and copy that as a base. So I'd put in whatever my new part number would be. Again, internal note, tags if I want to put anything new as a tag, and a new GTIN value, because in theory you should always have a new GTIN with a new item. Particular note action for source item here. When you're replacing an item, or when you're copying an item, you have the option of not doing anything to the source that you're using. You can supersede the source, or you can delete the source. So superseding it simply automatically puts in a new lifecycle code and the superseded by and from values on each part there. And delete obviously deletes the original item. So generally on a copy, use no action, but if you're replacing something from a supersession standpoint, there's some additional options that you have there. Below that, we can choose which values we want to include with our copy. I can select everything on the pies or aces side. Generally, I might want to get rid of the aces applications if it's a truly brand new item and not a supersession, or some other values. So make your selections there, say copy, and that's a very quick way to create a new item in the system. From the item profile page, we can click on product information, and we'll start to see the pies data that goes along with the item. Most of the sections over here, pretty much everything from assets up, relate to a pies specific element. So anything directly under item, for example, is a basic element. Then there's the XPI section, descriptions, and on down from there. To create or to modify values, always look kind of towards the top right of these gray sections for add or update links. So there's add, edit down here on the individual record. If I click edit, I can then see all of the fields that we support out of that PIES definition. There's help fields over here, pulling whatever references we can from the documentation for the PIES standard. So if you're looking for reference fields and those kind of things, look at those help icons. We're not defining any of these terms, so when you see a drop-down list or anything like that, we are just trying to align ourselves as closely as we can with that PIES standard on these pages. Within the EXPI elements, again, you'll see all of the different EXPI codes that are supported out there, as well as some deprecated fields. So over time, they've begun to drop EXPI codes that have been used, but they're still required by some receivers when you're sending them data. So since we're trying to support the standard going back to the 6.2 version, we still have to have those deprecated fields, but just be aware that if you're using a PIES 7 or newer version or something more recent than a 6.2, not all of these fields will be included in that file. Product descriptions are slightly different than what we had in the legacy system. The two main changes, you'll see a label description here, but understand that that is a label for PIES only. In the legacy system, the label description was carried into both PIES and your ACES file. In Premier, we've tried to disassociate the PIES data from the ACES data, so your label description here is PIES only. Your ACES label would be something set in this fitment setup menu here. There's also not an AAIA part type description. The part type is actually an element that goes under these basic elements out here. We have our part terminology ID. So that's not defined at a description level. But if I was adding a new description, I can choose whatever language that I want, put in whatever I want my descriptions to be, and save that. And I can create multiple sets of descriptions as I go. Add another description set. Stick with our base profile. This time, my German description, very similar to the other one. But I can create multiple languages if I'm trying to support that and keep creating as many different description sets as I need. Get rid of those. Packages. The package structure is slightly different in that we have combined both the English and the metric into a single structure here. So you're only defining the G10 and the package unit of measure once if you're trying to define both the English and metric versions. So you don't have to duplicate those packages. But know that as you're defining it, you do not have to provide both the inches and the metric. One or the other is just fine. And actually on packages there, also note that the difference between merchandise and shipping, that's a change that came about, I believe, in the 7.1 version. So previous dimensions are all going in as merchandising height, width, and length, and the shipping is a new dimension that they have added in the standard. Hazardous material we'll come back to momentarily. Jumping ahead to kits, you can define kits with whatever component is within that kit, identify whether that component ID is an item number, catalog number, supplemental number, etc. Define all that quantity, and you can target a different brand code if you're including another company's product within that. This long description is a description that goes out with the PIES XML file, whereas the other two are related just to my car part. So that long description is the one that's probably the most important to fill out in terms of a description on the kit. Sequence here communicates the order you want it to be included in the kit. That doesn't mean your receiver is going to present it that way, but that is what that is there to communicate. And then interchanges and product attributes. Before we get into that, I'm going to jump into product resources. So anytime we're dealing with something in the system that's a bit of a kind of catalog-wide setting that we have areas under product for product resources, application resources, and also under catalog. So as we go into product resources here, we're going to see interchange targets, pricing targets, attribute definitions, custom elements, and hazardous material profiles. So starting with our interchange targets, the idea is that we're going to define AC Delco as an interchange and make sure that we're communicating that consistently across the board. One of the most common elements in the legacy system where there was some inconsistency was within these interchange targets. The brand code might have a little bit of a spelling issue, or the name has case issues, a variety of things. So now we're defining these targets in one central location. So each interchange target in this case consists of the brand code, an Evokat display name, and a public display name, as well as the interchange type code and quality grade level. There's different display names here so that if you needed to have within your system an AC Delco reman, let's say, but when it goes out into the world it's just AC Delco, you can do that. However you need to define your data within your system, you can do that, and then communicate that as something else if you need to. But having all this information as a consistent value means that when you define an interchange for that particular item, all that you need to do is target this display name. You don't have to remember, should this be interchange type code S or O or any of those kind of things. You just target the display name and you're done. There's also an option here for internal use only. There isn't any kind of automatic logic in the background to say these are interchanges that should go out and these should not, based on the type code or any other rules. If you have an interchange that you need to track for internal purposes, but it should not be communicated to the world, make sure you check for internal use only here. Other elements within product resources, we have pricing targets. Pricing kind of provides an additional level of security within the PIE's data structure, because in order to include a price within your PIE's file, you have to opt in to a particular pricing target. So these prices are not related to tags or brands or anything like that. You create as many different targets, or basically groups, of your price. So if you have a price sheet that goes to Advance and a different price sheet that goes to O'Reilly, one of your target names might be Advance and the other one's O'Reilly. And put all those prices underneath that particular pricing target. Product attribute definitions. These are defined again at a central level to avoid creating case issues and spelling issues and things like that. And this is actually very similar to what was in the legacy system, in that you define your product attribute name or definition separate from the actual value. But you'll see the pattern here continues with having a different Evokat name versus a public name. You might have a value like diameter, for example, that has a different list of values for one particular part type than another. So having different internal Evokat names for that diameter allows you to make sure you choose the right one as you're creating your items there. But each of these attributes can optionally be associated with a PADB attribute if you're wanting to do that, or it can be disassociated if you don't need to. And as we look at our terms here, it is possible that your Evokat name with this last record again is different than the public name, different than the part type name, but know that if you're using this kind of a structure, when you send your data out, it's going to use one of these two values instead of your own internal term. Looking at the actual attribute itself, there are some additional targeting options that we have. We can set that up as a default value for particular part types and target at particular brands. That gets a little bit more advanced, so if you're wanting to do that, let's talk about that as a direct conversation. You'll see some assessments as you use the system talking about targeted attributes, and that's what we mean Hopefully, from a consistency standpoint, we can target a couple attributes as being required or desired for your part types and use that as a metric. But as we edit each attribute definition, we have the ability to define a set list of values. This little help icon shows that we have a pipe separated list of values there. You can have a space before or after. Those are cleaned out now. So in this case, it would give you options of value 1, value 2, value 3. So put in your list of values with a pipe separated or pipe delimited list there. You can define it a unit of measure, also a language. There's some multiple value options within a product attribute. So if you're setting or sending a set of drill bits, for example, you might list the individual values there and want them communicated as individual values. So again, if you have that particular need, talk to us and we'll walk you through it. And lastly, there's a help text. So you can put your own help text in so that when you're defining this value within the system, you can prompt your users with whatever kind of help information you need. It'll come up with one of those little question mark icons like we saw before. So as we've defined each of those things behind the scenes, and we come back to an interchange, for example, when I want to add a new interchange, I have my list of values here of what my particular targets were, and I already had AC Delco, but I simply pick that. I don't have to put in a brand code. It knows what that is behind the scenes. I can just put in my part number and go on from there. Product attributes follow a similar authoring pattern. A little bit more complicated because there's a branding element, but as I click Add New, I'm asked what brand I want to select. I know we haven't talked about brands yet, but product attributes and assets have the option of setting a universal value versus a specific brand value. So universal term would mean it would apply across all possible sub-brands, whereas base, in this case, it would just go to the base brand, but we'll talk about brands in a little bit. So as I target my brand code, I can then choose my attribute, and that had a yes or no list of values, so we go ahead and save that. I can add additional attributes if I need to here, or just click Save, and it'll add my attribute to the page. Editing the attribute, there's my help icon, by the way, showing the pop-up text of whatever help you have defined. But editing the value, again, we see it's a set list of values. I can target a different brand profile if I need to and move on from there. Pricing, when I add new prices, again, I choose from my price target and then price. We don't need to go through the details of how exactly to define a price, but on pricing, understand that a pricing target is separate from a tag, separate from a brand, and it has to be opted into in your PIES XML report. Assets, digital assets, can be any kind of file that you want to load, product image, brochure, whatever you need to do. There's a couple of different ways that you can load images into the system. Back under this product menu and digital assets, that's where we can create new items. So from this page, I can search for an existing item if I know something's out there, or to add new, just click this add link, and I can drag images directly to this page. I can put in a series of URLs if I have them hosted somewhere and then gather them that way. But as I load images, it will give me a little thumbnail preview down here, kind of letting me know it's a valid file. And then once I have everything loaded, I can load 50 images at a time to this particular page. But once I have those images loaded, there's a couple of values that you may want to set up here. You can set a default asset type and a default orientation. And then this auto associate to a product enables you to link the asset to an item if the asset name follows a similar pattern to your particular part number. So very often we'll see images that are the equivalent of the part number and then a dash and the word front or side or back or something of that nature. So in that case, we would want to auto associate the item to a product and the delimiting character. So the character in the file name that separates the part number from the rest of the file name, whether it's an extension or a term like front, could be a hyphen, could be a variety of things. So when I put that in there, if I was to click submit, it would load all of the images that are in my queue, and it would try to auto-associate it based on splitting or parsing out that part number to capture an item number and make those associations. But after you click submit, you should see a green bar that goes across this upload queue, or right below the upload queue. And that bar needs to complete across the page before you navigate on. So if you're loading very large images, you need to be patient with the process. And for some reason, with the magic of the internet, sometimes the connection seems to get a little bit wonky, and that green bar will just stop. If it stops and isn't moving, be patient for just a couple of seconds, but if it's still not moving, just click submit again, and that'll restart the process, and it should complete. Once that green bar goes all the way across, there will be a status with each of the images indicating that it has been uploaded, and that process is completed. We do generate a thumbnail from each of those images, and it can take a second to create the actual thumbnails. So when you come back to the image search, you may be presented with a default icon. There's default icons for PDFs and a couple other files that we can't reliably create thumbnails from. But if you did load a typical image file like a JPEG or PNG, that kind of a thing, we're creating a thumbnail. It's done in the background process. If it's not done yet, you will see a default icon, but very soon you should see an actual thumbnail for the image that you've loaded. There is an additional way to load images. We can create an FTP site if you're loading more than 50 images at a time. You can load those images up to the FTP and then use a system task to import them. So if that is something you need to do, we can set that up. Just let us know that that is desired, and we'll create that backdoor for loading images. So once the images are loaded, when we come back to our item, we would use the from the assets page, we click link to assets. We can do a search, and then once we have assets in the system, we'll have options under this action item on the right to link or unlink those images to our item. The other three values down here are not directly related to pies officially. Custom element is anything you want to define about your product as long as it's in a name value pair, very similar to a product attribute. The difference here is these custom elements will not go out in a pies file no matter what. It's just something that internally you might have a reference for your catalog or for your own ERP system, maybe an Amazon ASIN number, whatever other reference you have out there, you can define it and create it as a custom element so that this can be a master source of your data. The AAP attributes, if you're selling to Advance, you're familiar with the Advance UDA values, specific kind of catalog flags about where the product should be listed. Those are communicated as a product attribute, but it just kind of makes more sense to have them defined as a group of AAP attributes. So the AAP part types and yes, no values for ag and all these other values are out here as its own set of elements. And then lastly, the MCP attributes. There's a couple of attributes you can define that relate to how this information is presented on my car parts. You can have a buy now link, for example, a video link if you're going to a video channel, a couple things like that. And that list will continue to grow as we expand the My Car Parts offering. But these last three values down here do not list or do not associate directly with that pies XML standard. So moving on past the pies, we then come to our fitment setup and ACES applications. So we're getting back into the ACES side of things. Fitment setup is where we define what the valid part type is for the applications that are assigned to this item. And I mentioned before how the pies part type, there's a separate location for that than the ACES part type. There's a variety of parts. Think of bearings, harnesses, wiring harnesses, that kind of a thing, where the part type is just wiring harness, but it may have 20 or more different uses on an actual vehicle. So that's why there's a differentiation between the ACES part type and the PIES part type. But here we define what our valid ACES part types are. We can put in our manufacturing label, and we can also put in an alternative manufacturing label if we want to have some kind of an alternate out there. Epicor occasionally requires people to put in some default values that are different than what the brand actually wants. So that's why there's an alternative. Other elements on this fitment setup page include universal notes and ACES inheritance. We'll just talk about universal notes here real quick. There are situations where you may have a fitment note that really applies to the product itself and therefore should be included on each of that part's applications. A couple different strategies for that. Number one, you could remember to author that note on every one of those items' ACES records. But over time, you might miss something here or there. So the universal note is a way to define any one of these notes that are in your system as something that should always apply to that particular item. So every application you add from then on will basically automatically have that fitment note. Coming to the ACES application page, we see actually an example of something that maybe should be a universal note. This 45.5 inches long, if that's an element of this particular item, then that could be communicated a lot more clearly if it's a universal note, and therefore it would be consistently applied, but we can see it's only on a number of these applications. But getting past that, looking at the actual fitment records, presentation will be similar to what we had in the legacy system, your make, model, attributes, and notes, that kind of a thing. But our options over here are expanded on what we can do for that particular record. First one, editing the record. This page will be similar to what you're used to in the legacy system in that we show the actual item and the part type position, and you can edit those values if you need to. And then the vehicle attributes that are associated with it. Finally, the fitment notes, and then if there's an asset. Note that this asset is not an asset of the item. This is if you were to link an asset to the fitment record itself. Exhaust diagrams are a good example of a situation where people need to link assets to their fitment records because a diagram of that whole exhaust system is very helpful in determining the position of the item. So it's not just a picture of the product itself, but it has something to do with the actual fitment of the part. That's when you'd use that. Installation instructions is another option. If you have something that's very tailored to a particular vehicle, you could put something like that in there. But we do have a link on this page to look at a VIO estimate, and this is just at the year, make, model level. It doesn't get into this particular configuration of a fuel type and engine, but just at a year, make, model, that was the VIO that we have there. Some other options on this particular page, we can again ignore that configuration warning. Going back to the invalid resolution process, we can do the same thing here. We can use a carryover, which I'll show, which is also valid on the other page. But when I say carryover, it's going to show me 5 years before and 5 years in the future of this particular record and whether you have coverage for it. So a check mark in this VCDB column says this is a valid vehicle in the VCDB, and again, the valid vehicle is just the year, make, model combination. It's not saying that this particular engine combination here is valid. It's just the year, make, and model. And then the other two columns over here on the right show whether that vehicle is covered by this item or any other items. So this particular group is saying that they have coverage from 93 prior, but 94 and up, they do not have any coverage for it at all. So even though this is just kind of one particular snapshot, it's not looking at a great big picture, it is a way to look at some additional coverage opportunities for you. And then again, I can revalidate my group. If I wanted to revalidate all of these records because I've made a change, I can revalidate it from here. Closing the record comes back to that ACES setup page, and I have some other options over here under the actions. We were just looking at edit. We can duplicate the record. We can copy it to another item. We can move it to another item. And then there's that carryover again. And finally, delete. There's some additional options at the bottom of the list here. We can look at a detailed view, in which case we would change to a view that shows the part type and the quantity. So now I've got the part type and quantity showing there. I can delete all of this item's records. If I've looked at this information and I said, I need to get rid of these notes and do it a more consistent way, whatever I need to do there, I can delete them and remap them if that's what I want. I can revalidate all of these batches at the same time. And then finally, I can request a catalog builder ACES report for this item. So if I want to make some bulk changes to these records without having to click on every one of these edit items, I can export it to our catalog builder format, which is an Excel format, make the changes in Excel, and then come back up through that catalog builder and load it. But we'll talk about catalog builders later. The other option we can do from this page is our Add New Fitment Applications option. So if I needed to add a new fitment record, I can click on that, and it goes to our mapping process. The mapping process is different than what it was in the legacy system, but it's actually the same functions, just kind of reorganized so that you can navigate them in a variety of different ways. So now when I click Add New Fitment Applications, it takes me to the beginning of that mapping process. But I automatically have the item I was just looking at in the targeted item, or the mapping cart, you might say. The default position, whenever something is added up here, is going to be NA. So if you need to target a different position, edit that value and assign the new position. To add more items, simply click the Add and find your item and build that list out. Create as many items as you need within this particular record set. After that, I would start to add the vehicles that I want to select. So search VC2B for target vehicles takes me to a screen that will be very familiar to what you had in the legacy system. Once I pick a given year, make, and model, it then shows me the valid options for whatever I have configured for this particular mapping profile. Now, as I make my selections here, I see a live set of vehicles that come back from the VCDB. And I can have multiple selections as well. But as I make those, it shows me what the valid configurations are. I can select individual records if I want to just pick and choose here, or I can add them all to my mapping cart. When I say add all, I stay on the page though, because I can still select additional vehicles, and I can select more attributes or less than I did the first time. And I can continue this process as many times as I need to, picking as many different vehicles and years and attributes, etc., until I come back to my mapping page, and I have my item, and I have all of my applications that I had just selected. And it's a diverse set of records, as you can see down here. The Acuras are only mapped to an engine base, whereas the Volkswagens have an engine base and a drive type, and the Volvo was just a year, make, and model. So that flexibility allows you to almost map an entire parts fitment in one fell swoop. Additional flexibility that this page gives you that enables that is having two different places to add notes. If I add a note up here at the targeted item level, I currently have about 10 fitment records down here. So if I added a note, then all 10 times that this item gets associated with these applications, it will add that particular fitment note. Whereas if I add a note down here, then this note would only be applied to this particular fitment record and that item. So if I had a note of from June of 2006, I might add that to just this record, and that keeps it from being propagated across all of them. But if I had a note that said requires bucket seats or something that should apply to all of the records, I'd add that note up here at the top. and then I'd only have to add that once. But once I've got my targeted items correct and my applications, I would simply click Save Fitment Records. I'd get that same feedback letting me know if I created some conflicts or anything like that along the way. I also have the option to add a log entry on this particular page. So the log is just something that internally, if you have a reference for why you authored these applications, perhaps a work ticket that you want to tie things back to, or some other kind of reference catalog that you got this information from, you can put a log entry in there. It does not relate to your ACES data in any way. It just is something that you can see later to say, why did I create this record that way? But you can navigate this process a couple of different ways. Instead of coming from an item, I could have just come to Application and Map ACES Applications and started adding items that way. I could start adding vehicles before I add items. So it's all the same processes that we had in the legacy system. It just gives you that flexibility that you can keep revisiting a vehicle search or revisiting the items as often as you need to build the vehicle set that you need, or the fitment record set that you need. So as we're talking about authoring the fitment records, let's take a moment to talk about some of those catalog-wide definitions or the elements that you set up for applications. So again, we come back into our menu and we look for our resources, application resource menu in this case, and we'll start with the ACES mapping profiles. So as we did this mapping process, we were prompted for only two particular fields or additional attributes to choose. On this particular page, we can choose whatever mapping profiles have been created. In this case, I tried to start everybody off with something I just called standard. And then it shows the attributes that are currently defined for that particular mapping profile. I can add additional attributes if I need to and build this out with whatever I need to or whatever I want to select. And then I can drag my options around just like I could in the legacy system to change the order. The make, model, and year are fixed as the first three values though. However, when you add a new or edit an existing, you can decide whether you want to work that list in a make, model, year order, or if you'd rather see it as a year, make, model order. We've had a lot of requests, and I understand that there's a desire to be able to search not having these as the first three values. Perhaps you just want to see a make and a particular engine designation or manufacturer body code. So we're going to continue to work on providing some additional flexibility on how this page works. But for the moment, you start with a year, make, model combination or make, model, year. To add additional mapping profiles, again, we just click Add, create our new attribute, or our mapping profile name, and then when we come back to our mapping process and choose our vehicles, we would then see that additional option in our drop-down list there. Other resources, we have favorite ACES makes. This enables a list like this. So Volvo and Volkswagen currently are at the top of this list, but alphabetically they should be way down. So if you get tired of scrolling all the way down to get to something that you particularly care about, you can use this favorite makes process to have those values come up to the top. Similar to that, unwanted ACES makes, if you're never going to map to an Abarth or advanced mixer, you can use the resources and unwanted makes to remove those values from the drop-down. The fitment note library functions similar to what it did in the legacy system. We have the fitment notes just leaving the search blank and clicking search returns the fitment notes, shows a count of how many times those are used. I can drill into that and kind of see where that is. But I have an English, Spanish, and actually a French version as well. And my notes can be based on the QDB or not. So I can edit this and I'll see that I can put in whatever I want for Spanish or French. I can also define a set sequence so that if I want my notes to come out in a consistent presentation, I can do that. Doesn't matter how I author them. The sequence would define how they come out. And there's an option Sometimes notes need to be suppressed in a PDF file. You can suppress them there, but that's a custom. All the PDF reports are custom work, so we'd have to talk about that specifically. I can replace one note with another. So if I look at two notes and decide that they're really the same thing, 12 gauge and 12 gauge bullet type, for example, if that needed to be the same thing, then I could replace one note with the other and just consolidate that, and then finally deleting the note as well. When you send an ACES file out, it will use the English text as the note. If you do have a need to put in Spanish or French or a desire to do that in those files, let us know and we'll work with you on customizing the ACES reports to do that. The other option within this application resource menu is to copy ACES applications. So copying ACES applications, you define what your target set of records should be. So we have a set of copy from rules. In this case, we'd say we're going to copy from a particular item. And within that item, we want all of the records of a particular part terminology and a particular position. If I don't make selections here, then it will try and copy all records from that source item. I have the option of indicating whether I should be copying the applications or moving them. So copy would basically duplicate them under whatever the new part is, whereas moving would take them out of this item and just put it into the new record. But once we have our copy from, we then have our copy to rules. So we set our target SKU number, and then we can define what we want those records, part terminology, position, and quantity to be when they're received by this item. Generally, it will be the same as the source item, but occasionally you'll have two different part types that have the same fitment. They're related in some way. So you can use this copy or move function to move or copy all those applications from one part type and then override that part type with your resulting part number. It can also be done if you've decided to change the part type of your own item. So you could export all those records in a catalog builder, load them back up again, modify them manually, or use this copy function to say within the same application or within the same item, I want to move all my applications where it used to be starter cable and redefine them with a new part type of battery starter cable or something of that nature. But once we have that all defined, just click Save and it'll go do that move process in the background. Happens very fast, but it does happen as a background job, so it can take a second to run before you see that change immediately out there in the system. Moving on to the catalog menu, we start with the My Reports page, and the report engine is very similar to what we had in the legacy system. When we first come to this page, we do see a difference here with My Reports versus Shared Reports. When you generate a report definition in your account, it is by default something that only you can see. However, you can turn on Evokat sharing, which means that anybody that uses this catalog could see and download that report as well. So if you have a common definition, you can publish that or make it available to other people, and that just prevents them from trying to recreate the report but using different parameters and getting confused. But requesting a new report from the system, again, is similar to the legacy. We simply click Add, and then the report request form first prompts us for a report definition. Everybody's list of report definitions is going to be a little bit different. There's obviously a set of default reports, ACES text and XML kind of things that are out there. So just pick the targeted report format that you want, and then the page will adjust to give you whatever parameters are relevant to that particular report. So for an ACES 4 report, for example, first thing I need to do is put in a report name, and that is required. We need to target our brand profile, and this is where we pull that selling part number from. And again, if your item does not have a selling part number, it will not be included in an ACES or PIES file. And then finally, we see our Evokat sharing option up here in the primary report request section. So at this point, every item in the catalog is going to be reviewed for inclusion in this file. Now, if an item doesn't have ACES applications, then it wouldn't have any data, but it's still going to check every item. So the item filters is a mechanism where we can then limit the items that are considered for the report. And we can target that at this point for this report by tag, lifecycle, or part terminology. So if I choose tag A, then it will only include the items that are tagged with tag A and B, if items are in A or tag B, and then training, again, tag A, tag B, or training. And since that's all my tags, again, I could leave those all out, and it'd be the same thing as all items. If I use the lifecycle search here, it is important that you have defined your life cycles consistently. Because if I say I want to filter the report and only show where life cycle is available to order as a 2, but I've just forgotten to add a life cycle code to an item downstream, then that item will not be included. So if you start using lifecycle code, make sure that you populate it religiously in terms of the actual PIES data. And the other fields are all fairly self-explanatory, I think. Filtering by part type, you can filter applications by make. The ACES record set is kind of a bit of a new feature that we give you the ability to customize. Historically, we have always held direct conflicts and invalid configurations back in the system when you generate an ACES file. So now we give you some additional options. So when we refer to standard, that's what we mean. We're sending out basically your healthy ACES application files. But our other options, we can send out our standard set plus direct conflicts, our standard set plus any invalid configurations that we have, our standard set minus the extended conflicts, or anything that is valid. So when you start sending out records that have known issues, like direct conflicts and things like that, you simply need to expect your receiver to send you back some kind of assessment saying, hey, we found this conflict. So standard is just a way to minimize those assessments that you get back while you work on your data. You're not creating red flags downstream. And there's a description, again, when you use this help text, there's a description of what each of those values are. And then some other report customizations approved for the manufacturer label we looked at. There's primary and alternative if I'm wanting to include one or the other there, as well as an ACES document title. Other report definitions will have different customizations when we try and run a PIES, for example. I have the same item filters up here, but I have an additional item to indicate which pricing target I want to include. There's no sense in having an application filter, but as I said before, I have to opt in to including that value. By default, it will not include any prices at all. I have to specify that I want to include prices and which set of prices I want to include. There is an auto resubmit option on all of the reports up here. This will generate or regenerate your file on a regular basis, depending on what you have selected over here. I don't personally suggest that because I would encourage you to clean up your data and make sure you're generating good data instead of just generating data. But there is a reschedule or a submitting option there if you wanted to do that. There's also distribution groups. I haven't set those up in this particular account and generally don't do that as part of a training. But if you're interested in having designated FTP locations or email addresses where reports can be sent to from the system, let me know and we can walk through setting those things up together and explain how exactly that works. But you can have the system communicate the file through an email or an FTP address if that's what you're wanting to do. Some other options under this catalog menu, XML converters if you're getting data in again from a supplier, or if you just want to convert your own files so you can see what actually is in them. The XML converter will take PIES or ACES file and translate that to a set of Excel files that you can then open and actually look at the information. The file converter is a little bit hard to explain until you get into the catalog builders, but the process here with the file converter, it is easier, and typically you'll see values like product attributes are managed in what I consider a horizontal framework. And by that I mean the part number is listed as a single row, and then each of the product attributes is a column that follows past that. So part number 1 on row 1, part number 2 on row 2, and they could have as many attributes as you needed going off to the side horizontally. The catalog builder load file format, though, is more of a vertical format. So in that case, each part number and attribute name represents a distinct row. So if a part had 5 attributes, that would have 5 separate rows, each one being its own attribute. So this file converter process will take that horizontal layout and convert it into our load process. So if you're looking at an attribute grid report, making changes in that, and you need to load that back into the system, this is how you do that. Again, I'm very happy to walk anybody through that that's using this as a regular part of their process. Then we come to catalog builders. And catalog builder is our mechanism for loading data, ACES data, product data, but loading that in bulk. So all of our templates are based on Excel files. We can use the guide to using catalog build templates up here and download the individual formats. You can see descriptions of what they are, and as we click on any of these and download them, the resulting file will have a set of instructions on the first tab, and then it's the second tab that has the actual fields that you need to populate. You can always refer back to the appropriate page within the Premier system to see what the possible values are. But as you're loading information, it is important that the data you want to load is in a tab called Data. So if you try to create your own master template with all the different product elements together, you're creating a situation where the load process isn't going to know which tab it needs to load because it's going to try and find data. The load will check for to make sure that all of your columns are present. If your fields are related to lists of values within pies or ACES, it'll check to make sure that data is valid as well. So even if you're not wanting to provide one of these columns of data, it still needs to be a column in the file. So this is a fixed set of element names, column headings up there. And they do change over time. So EXPI, for example, those codes are coming out in the PCDB now. So occasionally we have to add new codes to the EXPI. So if you're loading something and you're getting some issues, come back and make sure you're loading the most recent version. And again, if you're having issues and can't get past us, send a copy of the file to us or let us know which one you're having problems with, and then we can give you some feedback on that. Once you have the data in the appropriate format, to make a change, and actually let me run through a process here starting from reports and go through it from end to end. So if I was wanting to update my EXPI data, I would start by adding a report, and then I would look for the EXPI catalog builder. So catalog builder pies EXPI, give it a report name, and I don't need to filter it by anything here. Go ahead and run that report. This just takes a second to run, but while I'm here, just to touch on the additional actions over here, the arrows are to resubmit the report. So anytime you run a report, it's kind of a snapshot in time. So if you've made changes to your actual data, need a new version, click resubmit, and it'll rerun that report. The I goes to information on that particular report. You can see the parameters that you put in. In this case, I didn't have any, but I can see when things were run, distribution groups, that kind of a thing. Now when I come back to this page and refresh it, shows the status is completed. So I can download my file and we'll look at the results. Again, this is going to be a catalog builder file that's using the template that we need for the catalog builder process. Got all my items listed, and let's say I want to add one of the new PIES EXPI codes that they added of product condition. The valid option there is new, and I want to define that for all of my items. So I just copy that, come down, paste it. So now all of my new items will have a condition of new. Save my file, something I can find. Now when I come back to the catalog builders, I'm going to upload a file. First thing I do is identify which template I'm loading. In this case, it's the EXPI template. Choose my file, EXPI train is what we called that, and upload it. It'll go through a process, and depending again on the size of the file, the complexity of the data, depends on how long it'll take. In this case, it's a very quick file, but it does an assessment process to make sure that all the values are okay. When I refresh this, it shows an approved submission, and I can then take some additional options. First action would be to download the file. If I need to see, wait, what was in that file, I can look at that again, can delete it, reassess it. So if I came back with some issues, it would say invalid submission. I could then click and drill into that and see what the issues were. It will eventually say row number 1 has this problem, or row number 2 has a different problem. But then the last option here is to actually process the file. So once it's an approved submission, I can process the file. So as I click on that, it asks whether I want to append this data, replace the data, or replace for a brand or price or interchange target. So in general terms, append would add the information to whatever is already in the catalog. So for an element like basic or EXPI data, where it's a one-to-one relationship with an item, an append basically has the same function as a replace. But if you're dealing with an interchange or ACES fitment, if you're adding new data to what's there and you want to keep everything in the system there, then you would use the append data option. When you use replace, it will drop whatever that related data element is. It will drop that entirely for the items included in the file. So if you're loading an interchange file for a particular part number and it included all of the interchanges you wanted for that item, you could use replace because it would just delete the application or delete the interchanges for that particular item. Whereas if you did append in that situation, you'd actually be creating some duplicate interchanges out there. So it's very important that you understand whether you're wanting to append or replace data. And then you have an option to do it a little bit more targeted, replacing for a particular brand, or if you have new prices for a particular target or interchange target, you can do it a little bit more of a fine grain level there. But in this case, since we're wanting to get rid of the existing EXPI data and load the new one in, I'm going to go ahead and load that as a replace. So I indicate it's a replace, say submit. That will actually start the process off in the background. It can, again, take some time depending on the size of the file that you're trying to load and the amount of data you're trying to process, but product information generally goes through pretty quickly. So once I say refresh the page, I see that it has been processed, and now when I come back to any one of those items and look at the EXPI data, I now have that product condition of new that we put in there. So each of the catalog builders, as you look at these templates, have different levels of complexity. Very much look forward to working with you to understand what your particular needs are in loading this information and any tweaks we can make to the process, and to help you kind of through that initial load, understanding where the data should go and that kind of a thing. But that's the way the catalog builder process works. The System Task Center is a way, it functions almost the same as the report library does. It just does not generate an output file. So if I've made changes in my catalog and I want to revalidate it, the entire catalog, I would do that through the system tasks. It launches a background process to do that, but since it doesn't generate a report back for you, it's considered a system task. So to define one of those, I simply say add and look at my task definitions, similar to a report definition. In this case, I might want to do an ACES catalog validation. You can indicate that it should notify you when it is complete, and then run that task. And then that will generate off in the background, and then in this case it would send you an email saying that notification was done. The ACES catalog validation really only needs to be done after you've done like a bulk load of a lot of information. Simply using the application throughout the day, resolving issues and that kind of thing does not warrant a full catalog validation. As you use the invalid resolution process, it will revalidate each of those batches individually. So this is just if you've made some changes that you think impact the catalog as a whole. If you simply want to update your metrics, those counts on the ACES Health page, there's a separate task here to update the ACES Health metrics. So again, as you're learning the system tasks and what they do, please reach out to us and we'll talk about what the functions are, how we see them being used, and if they don't quite meet your expectations, then we'll communicate a little bit better what each task does and add anything else that we need to out there. Catalog resources are where we define the brand profiles, part terminologies, distribution profiles, tags, and some other things that are important out there. But let's jump on brand profiles. Probably should have started here, but brand profile, if you have watched the other introduction, is a way to target different sets of information to different receivers for the same item. So we have many cases where one receiver might require a custom description or a custom part number, and you have to make those modifications, and you do that through this brand profile system. So it's not just private labeling. Even within the same brand, there's requirements, but it also works for private labeling. So within each of these brand profiles, this is where you assign the brand ID, and since it's at a parent level, it makes it much more consistent across all of your items. And this is where you indicate the contact information that should be in the header of PIEs and ACES files. So as we look at what this brand profile is, we have a name, base, a couple other elements that relate to a PIEs file, though hardly anybody ever uses them, and then finally the contact information. A brand profile, though, you must have one that is defined as that base profile in the system. At least one element has to be the base, and that sets up a relationship where it kind of has the master set of data. So if you have a sub brand off of that you haven't populated a description or a package or something like that, it will inherit the value from that base. Just keeps you from having to re-author the same information again and again. One of the other elements that the brand profiles provide is this market copy content. So alluded to that again in that first video as a way to communicate information across an entire brand or across a part type, but it is fairly complicated to understand or to communicate those relationships until you really get into it. So the market copy content is associated with this brand profile. And as we say we want to define a new market copy segment, we can see that we're asked to define a code and a reference, and then a subcode and a reference. So we're kind of defining our own hierarchy of targeting product data or targeting a set of products with a particular bit of data. So I might start with a broad code of a brand owner or brand parent, and then come down with a subcode of a part type or sub-brand, and continue down from there. You don't have to provide these, but you do need to understand that when you create an item, what these rules indicate the products or the data is going to be applied to. And then finally, the actual element itself, you have the option of either features and benefits or general copy. You define what sequence that should be in, language, code, and that actual content. But this relationship of the code and reference, subcode and subreference is important, that you have that accurate. So if you go down the process of creating market copy, I suggest you come up with a plan kind of on paper first, and then work with us and we'll help you set up those relationships to get that just right. You can also associate assets at a brand level. So if you had a logo or something like that you want to communicate across the board, you can do that too. Part terminology management. Within the PCDB, there's over 20,000 part types out there, and if you had a drop-down list of all of those in your catalog, it would be a lot to scroll through. So consistent with the legacy system, you activate which part types you want to see in your catalog. So if you've expanded your product assortment, need to add something, you kind of need to start here and add that part type. The part type itself is a jumping off point for some elements that are in this Insight menu, and specifically the PCDB viewer. So to add a new part type to your catalog, you would go to the PCDB viewer, search for your part type, and activate it from there. From this page, you can also click on any of these part terminology names and see the detail that's in the PCDB and the PADB. By going to battery cable, I can then see the information, descriptions, categories, etc. that comes from the PCDB. I see that this part type is valid in both ACES and PIES files. And then below that, the approved positions for this part type and the suggested attributes. So positions come from the PCDB, and the suggested attributes come from the PADB. We do encourage you to, at a minimum, look at the attributes the industry is requesting for your part type. You do not have to link them up to the IDs, but it is a increasingly popular thing for a receiver to request, is that you do use those PADB IDs, but you do not have to. But at a minimum, kind of best practice standpoint, at least familiarize yourself with what these attributes are and try and align your own data capture process with those attributes so you can communicate it when asked. But once we have those part types activated out here, that's what enables them to show up in the drop-down lists throughout the system. Other elements within the Catalog Resource Center are tags. Tags have an option of setting analytics here. So if I have edited this tag, and I'd have to recalculate the scorecard to show it, but back on our ACES Health page, we hadn't had this first option. Total fitment records gave us account and health detail. When I click on health detail, it'll give me a breakdown, initially by tag, of what my issues are. But it'll only do that for the tags that you have that analytics set to yes. Part terminologies, again, a breakdown by part type where our issues are. We can see most of our warnings and conflicts in this case are with starter cables. And if you have particular users that are targeting part types or targeting tags, these two health detail pages will help them narrow down their list to get there. But that is turned on at a tag level out here is this analytics. And that has to be turned on when you generate the ACES metrics to get that information to show. The last bit that we're going to look at today is this Insight menu. Insight gives you some visibility into the standards themselves. You can search the actual brand table. You can look at an archive of values. So if you have somebody send an assessment with an ID and you don't know what that is, you can search for the ID and see all the possible attributes and what values those translate into. You can also search the BCDB at a high level and see what the valid configurations are in the current BCDB. So picking a random vehicle here, I see that this as a vehicle, had two, so actually just the one submodel, but it is valid in both the US and Canada region. And then I can navigate the rest of this chain and see that a similar engine was present, but one's in the US, one's in Canada. And I can go on to the other kind of spokes of the VCDB and see what the possible configurations are. And again, mousing over the engine as an example shows the ID. So if you ever need to reference back to a record and make sure that that's the ID you're using, reference that ID as opposed to the name. PCDB viewer, we kind of touched on that with the part terminology management and how that works. QDB viewer, if you do want to use the QDB to create fitment notes, you have to start from the QDB and then work your way back to a note. So there's some additional functions that we haven't really talked about in the training, but we've gone over about an hour and a half now. So we'll leave the rest for some individual breakouts. But I hope that you've enjoyed this introduction to Premiere. I hope it's answered a lot of questions. And again, I encourage you to reach out to us as you move forward, and we'll do additional trainings and answer all your questions. Thank you.